שלום עידו.
שלום אליאנה.
שלום לכם וברוכים הבאים לפודקאסט שלנו רגע לפני.
היום אנחנו משוחחים באנגלית עם דניאל לוי, אנליסט, פרשן, סופר ויועץ לשעבר לממשלת ישראל, שהשתתף במשא ומתן הישראלי במסגרת פסגת תיכון ותהליך השלום של אוסלו ב'. כיום הוא מכהן כנשיא USMEP Project.
נצלול איתו לעומקו של תהליך אוסלו, לתנאים שהוליכו אליו, להתרחשויות מאחורי הקלעים, להבטחות שקוימו ולאלו שלא, ונבדוק מה אוסלו מלמד אותנו על התודעה הציונית. נדבר איתו על ישראל ויהדות העולם כיום, לאחר הג'נוסייד בעזה, ועל איזה עתיד אפשרי הוא רואה במזרח התיכון. שלום דניאל, ותודה רבה שהצטרפת אלינו.
שלום עידו ואליאנה.
אז אנחנו נעשה את הרעיון הזה באנגלית, מכיוון שעם העברית המצוינת שלך בכל זאת אתה חי ופועל באנגלית, would you like to present yourself?
ואני מתנצל שנעשה את זה באנגלית, אבל אני רוצה לדייק, ויותר נוח לי, כפי שאמרת באנגלית. So from now on, that's what we'll do. So my name is Daniel Levy. I currently run although I'm not based in the US, it's a US-based kind of think tank outfit, a 501c3 non-profit called the US Middle East Project. But having grown up in North London, I made Aliyah. I moved to Israel, was elected president of the World Union of Jewish Students, which is the first thing I did there. And then I joined Yair Hirschfeld and Ron Pundak and Yossi Biylin just after Oslo, and was involved in something called the Economic Cooperation Foundation, which they then set up to do kind of track to work with Palestinians. During my military service, I was brought into the office of the Mata'em Pulot B'Shtachim, of the coordinated activities in the territories, when Oslo B was being negotiated, and I was put on the team for the negotiations on Oslo B under Rabin. I then go back and spend time with Pundak and Hirschfeld again, and then go and work directly for Yossi Biylin, who was then a leading figure in the Labour Party. After we're part of the team that gets Ehud Barak elected, I go and work for Chaim Ramon in the Prime Minister's office as a special advisor. He was a minister in the Prime Minister's office. In the middle of that quite short Ehud Barak government, I go back and work for Biylin in the Justice Ministry. And although at Camp David in July of 2000, we're kind of the backroom team back in Israel, Biylin and therefore his team are not in Camp David. When it comes to Taba, the very end of Barak's term in January of 2001, Biylin's on the team. I'm part of that team when we're in the negotiations with the Palestinians in Taba. Subsequently, I get involved in the Geneva Initiative. I moved to the US to run Middle East work at a couple of US think tanks, Century Foundation and the New America Foundation. And then I moved back to the UK and head up Middle East at something called the European Council on Foreign Relations. So that's the trajectory of my work. I was a founder of J Street when it was set up, and do various other things.
Thank you.
So, Daniel, we thought best thing to do is to speak about Oslo in some detail, because you're an insider, and maybe I'll just try to frame it a bit in the frame of our project here in our podcast. This started as a reaction to the genocide in Gaza. And we've been speaking now, I think you're the 22nd or 23rd person we're speaking with, Palestinians and Jews. And there was a question, like always in the background of our podcast, concerning Zionism. And it's there's kind of a twofold way to look at what happened in Gaza in its connection to the Zionist project. I'll call the one current, like the radical current, who looks at Zionism as kind of an essential project, which entails the ethnical cleansing or even the completely demolition of Palestinians' life in Palestine, and sees it as Gaza as the, like what you could say, the logical development of Zionism from its beginning. The other current would be the one that claims that Zionism is not that an organic, inherent logic project. And there were many points in history where it could go also in other directions. And now it's understandable why Gaza kind of brought many people to this first current. But I think Oslo is probably, if we want to argue for Zionism having more than the possibility or entailing more than the possibility of just making ethnic cleansing and disappearing all Palestinians from here, Oslo is the moment in history where one could argue the most this could have gone in a different direction. So that would be great if we could just keep that in mind. Maybe we could get to some conclusions concerning that, because I think in your case, if I understand correctly with other conversations I heard you doing in our pre-conversations, I mean, your perception at the time and your perception now is changed for sure. And let's try and reflect on that. So if you don't mind, I would like to start looking at the reasons for Oslo, so to say. Maybe first from the geopolitical point of view. I think they call it in Israel חלון הזדמנויות, window of opportunity, which opened up after Madrid in 1990. And maybe you could say a bit about how you see the geopolitical situation at the time. Was Israel had a reason to go to Oslo in that direction, being pushed by things which had nothing, or let's say at least not immediately to do with their own understanding of itself and wishes?
Yeah. And I think, as you're implying, you can see Oslo as being discordant, as being the counterpoint to what you described as the essential camp, the inevitable logic of Zionism, but you can also see things inside Oslo which are confirmatory of the argument. So I like to plead non-determinism and to argue that you can make a very strong case that what we see in Gaza is the natural progression, but not necessarily the only inevitable outcome. So there were paths that it could have gone on. But let me jump into where you left things off, which is the backdrop to Oslo. That backdrop is obviously an amalgamation of different things. So the First Intifada is a really important part of that story. Popular Palestinian civil uprising, which wrongfoots what at that stage is a quite bedded down 20-year occupation that is effectively challenged and is trying to recalibrate itself, and is doing so in ways that are bringing to the fore, in many respects for the first time, the cost to Israel of maintaining that occupation. And remember, at that stage, there's still a direct cost. You don't yet have the so-called international donor community saying, no. If you want to control the Palestinians, we'll pay for it. We'll pay for a nice Bantustan. At this stage, Israel still has to manage a civil administration. There's the cost in terms of the deployment of the IDF. There's the reputational and image cost. Looking back on this 3+ decades later, we sadly see how easily Israel managed the reputational cost of being exposed in terms of the cruelty, the criminality of its actions that it inflicted on the Palestinians. But at the time, it was like, oh, wait a minute. This might be hard to manage. Why is these international spaces of support turning against us? And it was easier, therefore, to make a credible argument that the occupation and its consequences are holding Israel back from achieving the next phase of its success. success economically, socially, where it could go next.
But this success, this has something to do with the United States. I mean, this is. Can you look at Oslo from that point of view and what you just mentioned as the entering door or the key to enter into the new world order of post-Soviet, capitalist, neoliberal order? Was there something coming out of the American impulse of, if you want to get in, you need to start behaving?
It's implicit. That's what I'm suggesting. It was more how Israel, or how a sufficient part of the establishment interpreted the situation at the time. There was an assumption that, as you say, when and this is what we're driving towards. So simultaneous to what's happening on the ground, geopolitically, we're in a moment of unipolarity. We're in this post-collapse of the Soviet Union moment. America seems unchallenged. In fact, at the time, in the 90s, books are being written about the rise of Japan in the US more than the rise of China. You don't yet have either China as a clear peer competitor, the emergence that we have today of what some people call middle powers or regional powers, and you don't yet have America squandering its moment of unipolarity with silly wars in the Middle East, for instance. We're a decade and a bit before the Iraq War. And in parallel to Oslo, you have South Africa emerging from apartheid, which, with all the credit that should be accorded to the anti-apartheid movement and to the sanctions, that is also absolutely linked into the geopolitical moment, this unipolar moment where the South African regime can no longer say to the Americans, we're hugely important to you on the front line of communism in Africa, so you need to back us. That argument collapses. You have a shift, peace process in Northern Ireland, etc. So what a conclusion, at least, that gets tested and does the rounds in Israel is, in the context of Intifada, in the context of geopolitical shifts, as it then seems, and probably still today seems, the unassailable victory of a neoliberal capitalist order, as you called it, we're going to have to get on board with something, which means we're going to have to reorganize this, which brings in one other component that I'll mention, and there are others that I'm sure we're not going into, which is it coincides with a moment of historical weakness on the part of the PLO. So Israel also looks at this and says, can we do this on the cheap?
Oh.
Because remember, this is post-Iraq war. And the PLO, Iraq war of 1991, right? Iraq invades Kuwait, the PLO backs that. Palestinians are expelled from Kuwait. The PLO is now in the bad books of many Arab capitals. And the Intifada has taken away the leadership role from the external PLO leadership to the internal leadership. So Israel also experiences a PLO Tunis, as it then was, scrambling to reassert leadership, and discovers that perhaps the PLO under these circumstances, Reagan has recognized the PLO in 1988, at the very end of his presidency. Perhaps in these circumstances, you could get a deal which doesn't require the kinds of concessions that Israel had perhaps envisaged that would be required.
Okay, just a moment. This implies what you just said, that there was already an understanding at the beginning of the 90s, maybe even a little bit before, or an understanding developing during the first Intifada, which has to do also with the international situation of Israel as a state in this new becoming world, that at the end, this will have to have some solution. And this is a bit surprising for me, because, I mean, it's not surprising for me, but where is this new consciousness about this fact even coming from? Are we speaking about a specific group of Israeli, let's say, center-left intellectuals around Rabin, who out of the blue one day come out and say, we've been speaking with the Palestinians now behind the scenes, and we have this agreement, because this is how Oslo actually happened. But I want to understand from you, is this an understanding that you think Israel always had, in a sense, that there has to come a solution at one point, and this solution would be a state for the Palestinians, and now is a chance to do it on better terms? Or was it like kind of a new idea in the consciousness of the Israel ruling class?
So first of all, to be very upfront, I don't know. I've not interrogated that. At the time, I was young and new to the country, and those weren't the questions I was interrogated. I've never interrogated it as an intellectual supposition after that. From what I've read and from what I think about, first of all, we know that there were various back channels with the PLO, and there were PLO important figures who were themselves assassinated as a consequence of those back channels. There's the famous case of Ezer Weizmann, who goes on to become the president, who had a back channel in the 80s. And there are US influential public Jewish figures who open a back channel to the PLO in the 80s. And there is, of course, the US agencies, and this is where I mentioned that Reagan kind of formally does this recognition after the Algiers PNC declaration of 1988. But obviously there were American intelligence agencies that in different contexts had open channels to the PLO in different countries. That's Lebanon or elsewhere, for a significant amount of time. I think what's important for our purposes, perhaps, is that the water was tested by would the PLO accept a state on just 22% of the land? And would they accept Israel as a permanent fact? And the semi-unspoken, but it's undoubtedly there, implicitly at least, preposition therefore is, are you going to give up on the right of return?
Okay, we're coming to that. We will come to that. That's the.
But that's why when in 1988 at Algiers, the PLO basically adopts two states on the 67 lines, Israel has achieved a huge yes to not only the fact of its establishment, but also the facts it created on the ground between 47 and 49 in Nakba. And so we're talking here about a state that would be significantly larger than the UN partition plan. And it's that state that would be recognized. And once it's recognized by the Palestinians, who else is going to challenge it, right? So there was enough of a sense of maybe we should take yes for an answer.
Okay, so what you're describing is actually like a way of try, which brings with it a new concept about the possibility of the existence of a Palestinian state.
So, and here, let's insert something that's really important, because you made a distinction, and I've not really thought about it in these terms before, but it makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm going to run with it for this purpose of this moment of the conversation, which is, was there a group of thinkers who came from the center left in Israel, in out the establishment, who were driving this new path. And the reason I want to run with that is because the idea that Israel had achieved a huge strategic gain by this 78-22 mini Palestinian state willingness on the part of the PLO, once that hit the reality of a broader Israeli establishment, a broader Israeli system, not a handful of people in conversation with the PLO, but the Israeli state in all its apparatus, this ministry and that ministry and this division and this part of the idea, once they were put in a room with the Palestinians, it becomes an exercise in emptying this notion of Palestinian statehood of any meaning. So and this is what I personally witnessed at Oslo, which is that, yeah, those guys told you that we've accepted the 78-22 disposition division. Now let's dig into this. Okay, no, you can't really have control of that. You can't really have control of the other. We would have to still be here. This limitation would have to be imposed on you there. So, and this is where it takes time on the Palestinian side also, and this is let's not go here, but the scales drop from people's eyes, and what's really on offer is not a state.
Okay, so actually what you mentioned is the question of sincerity on the Israeli side to really come to a point where Palestinians have their own state. And this is when we really need to go into the details, see what was discussed from beginning on. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in Oslo Aleph, the idea was very general. It was more of we speak about autonomy in general. Oslo B, where you were already sitting in those discussions, was already concrete stuff. And I think there are I counted few, I think it's 5 main themes. We would like to go with you one by one and take time to see how genuine did you think back then, and how genuine do you think about it? How do you think about it now? How genuine was it from the Israeli side? And maybe later we can also see, you can tell us what you think the Palestinian side assumed about the Israeli intentions. So the first thing maybe is the most easier one. It's really a question of yes or no. The division of Jerusalem. Was that really on the table? Was Rabin really envisioning a possibility for that to happening?
So what we have to bear in mind here is that the structure of Oslo postpones the so-called final status issues until later in the process. And Jerusalem is listed amongst the so-called final status issues. And therefore, I think it's hard to make a designation as to where, had he not been assassinated, Rabin would have gone. And this is where I kind of push back a little against the determinism. And I can also quote Rabin's last speech to the Knesset, where he presented parts of Oslo, and he rejects a Palestinian state and all the other things. Was that his final word? It's unlikely. Would he have conducted the negotiations differently with all the baggage that he had, and with the Israeli system, which I'm pushing here as something that goes much deeper than any individual, and that would likely therefore have tripped this up anyway, irrespective of a very significant assassination. But I think the long answer to the yes or no question is we can't know, because the question was not on the agenda, if I'm remembering correctly, at the time. What we do know is that later on, under Barak, for instance, there are elements of, and significant elements of the division of Jerusalem that's on the table. And at one stage, there's even some internal polling which suggests this is sellable. to the Israeli public. But I think this applies across the board. But the system gets cold feet. The system can't, and it's not just about can we sell this to the public. It's there are enough obstacles within the system so that on every issue across the board, it is what is the most we can hold on to? What is the least we can give? And when you do that across every issue, you return to that same place, that what's ultimately on offer is something that falls well short.
I see. So the totality of the themes at the end will fail. We'll know that. But still, you just gave us an answer which surprised me a bit.
No.
It felt as if as you saw it, Eliana, maybe it was your feeling as well, there was a moment where Jerusalem was on the table. Because it was presented in Camp David as if, from the Palestinian side, as if Barak wasn't really willing to speak about Jerusalem. And that's a very important point in the history of Oslo, you know?
So I want to make sure. So look, Barak, if you remember, inherits Wye River from Netanyahu, right? Agreed in 1998. And Barak says, let's not implement this partial agreement. Let's go for the full deal. It's easier for me to do this in one push rather than. And so as things continue to, the conditions on the Palestinian side continue to deteriorate, and the Palestinian negotiators, and we've jumped forward here to 99, 2000, Palestinians in 2000 are saying, look, this is a pressure cooker. This is going to explode. You're sending us to Camp David in circumstances where the odds are stacked against us. At least ease some of this. Show some commitment by doing some of the Wye River stuff, such as redesignating some of the surrounding villages, not even in municipal Jerusalem, but outside municipal Jerusalem, as I think it's C to B, but it could be B to A in terms of this internal delineation of Oslo. Barak refuses. And I might be jumping ahead to Taba here rather than to Camp David. But look, there's a question. It's a legitimate question. Was Taba anything more than a kind of Ben Ami, Amnon Lipkin, Biylin-esque intellectual exploration of what could have been? And it's a very legitimate question to ask. So I would say let's leave that one a bit open, but it's not as clear cut as no, there was never any prospect of movement on Jerusalem.
Okay, speaking about things that were supposed to be decided after, איך קוראים למשיח? After the Messiah came.
Coming of the Messiah.
Yeah, coming of the Messiah. The rights of return. Okay, and let's really stay on that because me and Eliana both, I think we went to this experience of the moment you get out of Israel and you meet Palestinians and you start getting exposed to real Palestinian talks, and the public cannot see you, but you give me now ברור שזה ככה movement. So, I mean, the right of return of the Palestinians was in my memory, or at least in my consciousness when I was, growing up and started to read and see what's going on around me, was like the thing that you felt Israelis were sure that's what they're going to give up on. They're not serious about it. And inside the Masā u'Matan, inside the whole Oslo, there has to be one thing that the Palestinians, it needs to look as if they also made some kind of compromise. Thank you. And the idea of the right of return until today in the Israel Zionist mind is not even an idea. It's an impossibility. And I would like to hear your opinion about how did it look in your eyes when you saw the discussions on that? If you looked at people like Biylin or Pundak, or even if you got to see Rabin, Peres speak about it, and how did the Palestinians saw it? That would look to me like the biggest problem of all, which was like postponed to an unknown moment, but at the end would have to put everything in jeopardy.
So I guess I want to start with a general observation, which very much aligns with what you said about, in a Zionist setting, it's an absolute sine qua non, unquestionable assumption that this is something kimat ez, it's put in the room in order to be taken out. There's no Palestinian seriousness, and anyone who is serious, it shows their bad faith, because the right of return is automatically assumed to be a way of a subtext for saying anything from the destruction of the state of Israel to throwing the Jews in the sea to any of those things. And the thing I want to point out is, and of course, you, I, Eliana, we're not the only people who've gone, okay, so this is a real thing. Your refugeehood experience is something we have to take seriously. This is the essence of how Palestinians understand their modern history, their dispossession, etc. And what that says to me is that it's actually very normal in a relationship of such power asymmetry, and especially if that relationship has colonial or settler colonial dimensions, the colonizing, powerful side of that equation really doesn't do much homework, doesn't feel any need to understand this people who they are taking the land over, removing, dispossessing, keeping without their rights, etc. It's this amorphous, unwashed mass. It's, we don't have to take too seriously the myths that they tell themselves. We don't have to get to know them. Whereas, and it's not true just in the case of Israel, Zionism, Palestinians. It's true across across the expanse of the history of colonialism and settler colonies and asymmetries of power. Whereas those people who are being denied their rights by some greater force absolutely need to get to know, what is this thing? What is this? And so they are much more familiar with Israeli Zionist psyche, positions, etc., than we are with Palestinians. And so it is a rude awakening, but it's a rather typical laziness and dismissiveness on the part of the settler colony, let's say, in this respect. Now, that is the working assumption going into this is, well, by accepting two states, PLO, Palestinians, what you have therefore accepted is Jewish state. There is no Jewish state with a right of return, and therefore there's nothing to talk about here, right? Actually, what there is to talk about is we're going to limit the pace and number of Palestinians who can go to the state that we're allowing you very generously to have. That's what there is to talk about here. So compensation? No. None of this is, and that was the defining motif, if you like, in terms of how the refugee question should be dealt with. And here I also want to pause and say, this was part of what we spoke about earlier, the weakness of the PLO at this historic juncture, that they didn't articulate this position, that they didn't have a popular mandate for going down that path. Now, by way of anecdote, the file that Biylin, and by extension myself in the talks, were specifically tasked with negotiating in Taba was the refugee file. So I get a phone call from Yossi. Daniel Elders just asked us to be part of the team in Taba. We're leaving whatever day it is. They're going to send round the files from Camp David. We're looking at the refugee file, so I'll get that to you. The talks will start. It was it was very quick, and I don't know how much stuff was redacted, but we get this very, very, very flimsy file on the refugees, and it's essentially a short note after Camp David recounting what happened in the talks, written by the person who at Camp David was in charge of this file, who was, if I'm not mistaken, the Yoamash at the time, Eliakim Rubinstein. He goes on to become a Supreme Court judge, and he was famous for telling nice, classic Yiddish jokes. And basically, it's a quite jovial text written by Eliakim Rubinstein, basically saying they thought this was something to discuss. We told them why there's nothing to discuss here. End of conversation. So the capturing of the refugee negotiations at Camp David was Eliakim saying, I told them some nice jokes in Yiddish. There was nothing. What was I supposed to do in this negotiation room? What is there to talk about, right? And it was like, oh, okay. Yossi and our approach, sitting opposite Nabil Shah as the Palestinian tasked with negotiating this file in Taba, was very different. And I think it was one of the more controversial parts of the Taba negotiations. I actually think Yossi handled this very well in a very disarming way, and he started off by saying, "Look, you don't have to tell me about Nakba. I'm very familiar with the story, the history, the significance for Palestinians. Now, what are we going to do about it? Do we agree on a narrative? How do we address the issue of compensation? Can there be something that, in numerical terms, is more symbolic in terms of actual return, but for you, it shows that we have acknowledged." And we come out with a text. It is never actually, it's kind of made public sometime later, but there's no interest in Israel. I mean, you'd think maybe this is a big story. Wow. But there's no interest in interrogating it for many of the reasons that we've touched on already. And I'll pause here. I mean, we can take it through to kind of what the failure of Oslo tells us and where we are today and how, look, Oslo, because this, for me, this is the nub of it. Oslo was an attempt a quarter century after the 67 war to say, we can't touch 48. We can't touch Zionism in its essence. That's the holy of holies. There's no meeting ground here. But we can undo 67. And so let's try and resolve 67, a quarter of a century after 67. Fast forward 30 plus years, that small period between 48 and 67 is now, it's less than a quarter, or approximately a quarter of the existence of the post-establishment of Israel conflict. The idea that you can simply address 67 and not address 48, especially when Israel is now all about finishing the Nakba, forget about it. That's why the idea of going back to anything like Oslo is, to my mind, so I'm serious.
Okay. So
yes, we ran way too far.
No, it's perfect. I will bring you back to Oslo, but I'm sorry. This is really what I was hoping for, because now you are actually telling, hoping. I wasn't hoping, but I foreseen the possibility that you would actually tell the Israeli so-called liberal left, or what's left of it, that they're talking about two states is still ignoring this 48-67 problem. And even if maybe concerning the momentum of the beginning of the 90s, there was some kind of possibility to smear the Palestinians, למרוח אותם, כמו שאומרים.
Okay.
Now it became even more acute for them to look at the reality of the real problem being actually 48, not to mention the real problem in the eyes of Palestinians. And we're not speaking about justice. We're speaking about pragmatical view of how the Palestinians see this. They're also a side of it. And still we have now, and we spoke with Ofer Kasif here. Okay, that's Hadash. Okay, that's a Marxist. And I had a discussion with him, and he's like, two states. The whole two states, one state discussion is actually somehow connected to that. You're telling me the whole idea floating with Oslo is that, we can start history at the point which is comfortable for us. But the other side is a completely different history. And this is now even actually not seeing that. That's what exploded in our face so much. And it brings me to this question of essentialism, because, the Zionists, he tells himself, I can start when I want to because I'm the stronger side here. And they would just agree on it. And he doesn't ask himself, how far are they willing to go? And then everything they do seems like crazy. And everything you do seems like it's super rational. But it has nothing to do with real history anymore.
I think here's where we have to pause and say the arrangements can come into being, and I'm not just talking about Palestine, Israel here, which are far from just, are far from setting a historic record straight, far from achieving historical justice, but can be a significant improvement on what has gone before and can allow people to face the future with a better prospect. And either you can circle back and say, hey, you know what, we skipped over something that really matters, and at some stage we're going to have to come to terms with it. And maybe now is the time to do that. So what I'm saying here is that I don't want to totally negate a legitimate Palestinian logic in at a point in history saying, let's at least reverse 67. Let's at least get a mini state. Now, given the state of co-opted, appalling disrepair and political unrepresentativeness of the PLO, PA, Fatah today, and we're having our conversation just a couple of weeks after the latest round of deeply disturbing internal Palestinian Fatah elections. So the fact that that is the state of disrepair, which was inevitable if you just kept pushing Oslo forward, the fact that that is the case does not mean that there was no validity or justification whatsoever in a PLO pursuit of getting what it could in the early 1990s, while acknowledging that a Palestinian intellectual, diaspora, refugee, and activist class at the time, there's the famous Edward Said critique of Oslo from the beginning. There's things that negotiators who left when the PLO kind of moved its Tunis people in. I get all of that. and I have sympathy with it. But there is an argument to be made that if you could have got closure with a moment in history, and perhaps even a moment in Israel's political history, if you could have actually got the withdrawal of the 67 occupation, that we might be in a better position today, including to address other things like refugees. And so for me, it's very telling in terms of trying to address this essentialist argument. It's very telling that under the most propitious of circumstances, the most user-friendly of circumstances, for a Zionism that was ready to draw a line under 1967, but still not ready to touch 1948, Israel, the Zionist project in its actual existing manifestation of the state of Israel, was unable and unwilling to go there.
Can I build on that? Because it brings us to the third point. Settlements.
Yes.
The two first points were abstract. Jerusalem and right of return. We'll speak about it when the Messiah will come. But if one wants to make the argument about the seriousity of Israel, one would say, look what happened when we started. Around 100,000 settlers, 91. Look what happened 10 years later when Daniel is sitting in B'Taba. It's more than doubled. And these are facts on the ground. So how was that? How did the Israeli and Vaya, could justify that? What was the idea behind it? If you were already planning clear borders, why continuing and doing that?
So, as you know, the standard response is, נגיע ליום שנצטרך ללכת ראש בכיר איתם. אז למה לנו עכשיו? Why to preempt? Why should we preempt this moment of truth with the settlers? It's going to be difficult. When we get to that moment, we can deal with them. Oh, by the way, yes, we are going to change the map because now Modin Elite has been added, or Beitar Elite has been added, or this got bigger. It's not something we can really withdraw anymore. No, it's still fine. It's all good. Oh, that kind of creates this Israeli enclave deep into the heart of your supposed future state. There's a bypass road. It's okay. And that's where it's impossible to look at this history and say, that this would have taken anything other than a monumental I think, redefining of what the project is. You had to, for me, it shows that you needed a moment of reckoning with Palestinian existence to actually get beyond putting on the table, at best, something that was far short of Palestinian sovereignty, that could always be recalibrated and reshifted to suit you, and that ends where we see it ends, which is a very transparent Bantustan apartheid system. Because otherwise, it's always, we're in the position of power, so we can always and you'll just accept that next layer of the hollowing out of what remains for Palestinians, because we don't, at the end of the day, acknowledge or accept Palestinianness. A Palestinian national collective that we are going to have to come to terms with. And therefore, let's put alongside everything I've just said, historic Palestinian mistake, moment of Palestinian weakness, which was exploited, that they didn't say, no, wait a minute, this is nonsense. Of course we can't continue without, first of all, of course we can't sign this without an absolute freeze on any settlement expansion. But at any iteration, to say stop, no more. And that moment never came for this weakened, co-opted Palestinian Authority, etc. And so there was the usual games where Oslo itself says, if I'm remembering the exact wording correctly, there will be nothing that neither side will take unilateral steps that impact something like the final status issues. Palestinians could claim, well, that means Israel is in violation of Oslo by expanding settlements. Israel could say, well, no, settlements is clearly a final status issue, so we don't discuss that until then, etc. So two more brief thoughts on this. What's relevant here that also takes us back to the terrain of 48 refugees, etc., I think, is that it was inadmissible as far as the Israeli side was concerned throughout to have anything that talked about historic justice, or like you have truth and reconciliation is a well-known tool in conflict resolution. It was, of course, used in South Africa. And that was never allowed in the room, any discussion of something like that, because it was to avoid that history of 48. The other thing, of course, that's relevant both on the refugee and on the settlement and on pretty much every other file is, going back to Ofer Kasif, going back to the position of Jabha of Hadash, the two-state idea is increasingly indistinguishable from formalizing the terms of apartheid. And there is a one-state reality now. And there has been for quite a long time. And it's possible. It's if one is imaginative enough, it's conceivable that at a certain point, Israel says, you know what? It's too much to try and absorb all these Palestinians. We've tried to expel them. It looked quite good. We tried to squeeze them in Bantustans. It looked quite promising. But at the end of the day, it didn't work. We can pull back to certain lines. But the reality we have today so much more leans itself in the direction of saying there is a Jewish Israeli population, there is a Palestinian Arab population, even if one is settler colonial via the Zionist movement, neither should be pushed off this land, neither are leaving this land. Partition has led us down the road of apartheid and of zero-sum thinking, and of Israel doing one Nakba and then slow Nakbas and now pushing for a big Nakba. Surely the other way forward is to think how we create some sense of equality, shared interest in living differently in this one space, and surely that could offer more security for both peoples, as difficult as that is to envisage in a post-Gaza genocide and post-October 7th reality. But anyway, so that's I think, to me, is a much more reasonable premise from which to start any future conversation.
Daniel, can I ask you, looking at the Palestinian side, if one wants to argue, not just calling them naive, but saying, okay, they had some reasons to go on with it and to hope that it will turn out better for them. So, division of resources and Palestinian autonomy were two things where I think one could objectively look at what happened and say, okay, this is something you cannot ignore. Would you agree that was where Israeli intentions could be interpreted as serious on those two aspects?
Give me one more sentence of explanation, so I'm sure I get what you're saying.
Meaning, if I am promising somebody a state, then I need to promise him also some resources he could live on, and that was a big part of Oslo B. And the second one is that the Palestinians got an autonomy in a sense, what became out of it and what it is now, but it was still a huge step at the moment. So was Palestinian hope of Oslo becoming serious maybe was based more on that?
It's hard for me to put myself in anyone's shoes, and certainly those shoes.
No, but did you see it as serious suggestions or serious handling from the Israeli side?
Given that a Palestinian Authority was established, given that that looked like something historic, given that there was the transfer of certain powers and some withdrawal of Israeli forces, this looked like it might be a journey that could have a decent end destination. Certainly an end destination that was better than what preceded it, even if it was not ideal. And I think that what kind of greased the wheels, what made some kind of Palestinian acceptance, particularly amongst their leadership, more possible, was an assumption, was two assumptions actually, both of which turned out to be misplaced. First of all, that the world was on board with this. And therefore, Israel wouldn't be able to deviate too much from the path that Oslo seemed to have set us on. Right? So number one, a naive assumption as to the nature of the world. And number two, and then this was helped by who their Israeli interlocutors were most of the time. And number two, that there was a certain rationality, a certain pragmatic definition of self-interest on the Israeli side, right? That they believed that when Israelis told themselves, we can't maintain our Jewish democratic state if we absorb all this land, if we absorb all the Palestinians, so therefore we need to divest ourselves of this land, of these Palestinians. Those two things combined would create the gravitational pull to get to a finishing line of a Palestinian state. So a misreading of global realities, including realities that they could have pushed back against, and a misreading of Israeli realities. And then a third element kicks in. And it kicks in over time until you get to where we are today, which is you begin to cultivate, and Israel and the donor community very effectively cultivated, a Palestinian political class committed to the status quo. So you have a process of co-optation where these people ultimately are not representing their own people. They're not driving a Palestinian aspiration rooted in Palestinian legitimacy. That's why they don't have proper elections. They are desperately unpopular amongst their own people. And you create the Oslo class on the Palestinian leadership side.
You just mentioned the Palestinians underestimating or not understanding correctly what was the real position of the rest of the world. And with world, we mean United States at that moment. Concerning its support in the Zionist project, in a sense. And I remember you saying in another interview, you used the term Israel's attorney when you describe the feeling you had while sitting in the room with Palestinian and Israelis delegation. You perceived the Americans as acting as Israel's attorney. Can you explain a bit what does that actually mean?
Sure, and let me be clear. The co-optation over the years of let's just use that short term and call it the Palestinian Oslo class, that is worthy of criticism. The misreading by the Palestinians, the naivety about the US and the world, many people shared that. So here it's not, this isn't a unique criticism of a Palestinian reading of political maps. I mean, I think many of us, if I fast forward to now, the willingness to indulge what Israel has done in Gaza, I think has been a big shock. Even for the hard-headed realists who have little faith in Western powers still. So the phrase Israel's lawyer was actually used by Aaron David Miller, who was a member of the American negotiating team across multiple administrations. And there are lots of ways you can come at this. And all of them have a part to play in this story. And part of it is American political actors and officials and electeds are so steeped, so marinated, like one marinades a piece of meat in Zionist narratives. They are so pervasive in American political culture, so ignorant of Palestinian historical experiences and Palestinian narratives that it's almost natural. Now, part of that putting together the marinating sauce is not a coincidence, of course. That is the effectiveness of an Israel lobby, which, we're in the throes of a war that it's impossible, I think, between the US and Israel and Iran. It's impossible to understand that without the influence that Israel has. So it's not a contentious thing to talk about the role of that Israel lobby. Throw in the Judeo-Christian civilization.
Money.
Throw in money. You have very transparent. You even now have a video that's going around of one of the historic kind of pseudo-intellectual, I would call him, Jonathan Podhoretz, in talking about how it's good that the Jews have shown that we have the money to win congressional races. I mean, that blunt, that bold, things that a non-Jew says and they're immediately tarnished with being an anti-Semite, but Podhoretz can apparently get away with it. Anyway, you throw these things into the mix. Let's also throw into the mix that what's not to like in a settler colonial society treating the indigenous population this way if you're American.
So that's imperialism. So I wanted to ask you about that. Would you go that far? I mean, I would go that far, but were you sitting there and looking at them and say, look at these white people. They're actually identifying themselves with the project philosophically, that for all they care, it's just one more place where, like you said, settler colonials are now acting, and why should it even bother them?
So if I'm going to be honest to my 30-something self, then no, I wasn't just sitting there thinking that. Do I subsequently draw that conclusion? Yes. Or 20-something self earlier on in Oslo. But yeah, so you put all those things together, and the end product is a US system that was and remains deeply, deeply indulgent of Israel being able to get away with anything. And therefore, when you're in a negotiating setting that is so profoundly asymmetrical, where you have such a mismatch in the equation of power, and then when the decisive external power puts its thumb on the scales on the side of the powerful occupying party, there was only one outcome, which is where we live today. which is reaching a stage where a Democrat administration, the Biden administration, if I fast forward to now, still refuses, the Democrat Party still refuses to acknowledge the role that Gaza played in the election defeat of 2024, in Trump's return to power. And now there's some of these characters who are instrumental in enabling and facilitating genocide, and let's not mince our words here, the Jake Sullivans of this world. Now they'll do an interview, they say, oh, it keeps me up at night, could I have done more, but I couldn't really do more. Unfortunately, if people like that remain in positions of power, then this won't change, but I do see shifts. So the story here is not unidirectional. It is actually a story of fluidity right now, where there is a possibility, at least, of change.
Can you tell which possible change you see, which shifts you see?
I think this is very much the question that will determine quite a lot in the next period, and has come to the fore with this war against Iran. And the way I would look at it is, does Israel, and here Netanyahu does assume we haven't talked much about him, which is a good thing, because we tend to go down this cul-de-sac of it's all Netanyahu. And
not
so
in
God
this
bless
podcast,
us.
Not here, don't worry.
Good. So let's nonetheless finally raise his name, because he's important in this respect. Is Netanyahu and is the Israeli system looking at what it's doing right now with the US and saying, yes, we've lost some support. It's maybe not the best look that a war that really hasn't gone as we anticipated it is hard to depict as something which we weren't a prime mover in. So, but we still know how to manage American politics. We've got all these levers. We know how to use them. Look at this latest round of election of primary elections, where if you throw enough AIPAC affiliated money, even if you disguise it as other things, campaign expenditure, independent campaign expenditure in the US, it's still the best democracy money can buy. And we have more money than the other side. And there are all these other things that work to our advantage. Whether that's the prevalence of Islamophobia, or whether it's the fact that our friends are buying up legacy and new media. So the Ellison and family bought American TikTok. Netanyahu openly said, what's the most important thing when he met some influencers is that we're buying the new media, we're influencing X. They've bought CBS, Warner's, CNN now. We've got this, don't worry. Now, I think that may be a tad over-optimistic on their part. The shift in public opinion is pretty profound and relentless, and crucially, it is impacting the GOP side as well. The America first versus Israel first. It's too early to say how this will play out, but it is unprecedented for there to be this kind of challenge to the Israeli narrative. Nonetheless, one way of looking at it, just to finish the thought, is we've got this. We can reverse the dial. But the other way of looking at it is maybe, and again, I'm going to use the name Netanyahu, maybe Netanyahu is looking one step ahead of the game and saying, you know what? We can't keep America in this place forever. It was inevitable. All good things come to an end. But it's not just our influence in America that's coming to an end. American primacy and preeminence is coming to an end. We do not live in a unipolar world. America is in decline. Have I hastened the decline? Have I made things even worse for America with this war in Iran? You bet I have. But let's use it while we have it. And what we can do is, if we can get enough achieved while we still have America doing this, while we still have America in this war in the Middle East, if we can achieve a position of our own preeminence in the greater region, then we establish a new order of power. When Israel came into being, America was not the superpower. We aligned ourselves with the Brits. In Suez, we aligned ourselves with the Brits and the French. Yes, we accelerated their decline in Suez as well, by the way. But okay. Then we attached ourselves to the US. As we move into a new era where there will not be a global hegemon, you need to have regional hegemons. And if we can root ourselves as the regional hegemon, we've started this with the UAE, and maybe as an outcome of this Iran war, the other Gulf states will simply have to align themselves with that position. And India appreciates the power that we bring to the table. And he talked about this. Netanyahu talked about this when Modi was on the eve of Modi's visit. He uses a phrase in a meeting of the cabinet. He says, we're going to establish a hexagon of alliances. And he has subsequently used this phrase, Israel is not only a regional power, but is becoming a global power. And you know, he has done things. This isn't just talk. Israel has an alliance with Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa. Israel is seeking to integrate itself into how Europe thinks about rearmament and about energy. The relations with Greece and Cyprus, the armament relationship with the most important European state, Germany. So he is envisaging a new relation in which Israel can be a dominant power in this region. It will need America less. And that's the contemporary incarnation of how Israel has always aligned itself with external powers to get its way. I don't think it can work myself. I can't be sure. It is a very bold play. And it is rooted in the thing we've spent all our time talking about, which is the Palestinian question. Because the premise of the entire hard power hegemon project is, given what we do and what we will continue to do, and we may even do more horribly to the Palestinians, we can't be just another state in this part of the world that everyone can have nice relations with. We have to do this from a position of dominance because the public around us, yeah, maybe there's a leader in one kind of country that can stomach it and can go along with it and can control his own public opinion enough. But this is unpopular. It causes resentment. It causes anger. So we have to impose ourselves using hard power. But we can do it. Now, I don't think a small country that has its own internal divisions, that is bleeding credibility globally, is going to be able to pull this off. And I think the blowback could be catastrophic. But so far, I've not been proven right. So it's big.
Daniel, that was real politics. I mean, this is like tactical, pragmatical, strategical thinking of Bibi or the state of Israel. But now I want maybe to finish this interview with a different question, to put it back, or not back, just to put it once on, I don't want to say the moral area of the conversation. But what just happened these last 2.5 years has consequences not only on Israel's strategic place as a power in the Middle East or a world power, for all I care. There was a genocide happening, and we don't need the legal discussion for that. Let's just use this word now as a crime against the Palestinians done by Israeli Jewish state, which has completely changed the reality and consciousness of that society itself. It has huge influence of Jewish people like you, me, and Eliana outside of Israel. It has huge influence, like you said, on the moral discussion, ethical discussion, political, moral, ethical discussion in the United States and other places. And when you were watching that happening, and now I listen to you speaking dry political, tactical terms, how do you feel about this whole project you were so involved in? And what are your thoughts about that? Is it possible to do this separation because you are giving political advice? This is also your job in a sense. But, we're human beings. And, it's for me, it's for example, very painful that what happened in Gaza seemed to be put under the rug, טוטא מתחת לשטיח, faster than we have thought would be possible. It's like Iran is a crazy thing, but not to mention Gaza still happening. It is something that, it gives a form and content to a completely new society and world. And we cannot maybe looking at it only from the political strategical point of how we get a state or that or that. I mean, this whole society has now almost lost all its ethical credibility.
Yeah, it's what does one do with a society where consent has been manufactured and now there is enthusiasm around it for genocide and even if that subsides, then for elements of ongoing dispossession, displacement and ethnic cleansing, and the only alternative in the political marketplace is apartheid. I mean, this Israeli election is going to be fought between an apartheid camp and a genocide camp when it comes to the Palestinians. I mean, I don't know what to do with that. That's just a thing of such magnitude to try and contemplate how one reverse engineers some of that. And by the way, I genuinely think that the strategic logic that I just set out, which I don't think will work, but has progressed further than one would like to see. I think Israel is perhaps, and maybe this begins to give us just a thread, just a little thread that maybe we could pull on. I think Israel will actually be at a loss without Netanyahu. And I'm not saying he's gone in October, but it's a decent possibility. That you actually needed this historic figure to be able to pursue that logic. And I think there will be a real turn and a difficulty in replicating some of this stuff without him. So where does that leave us? One of the things that I think we now have is I do really think this is growing, and I think this is of significance. A Jewish consciousness, primarily outside of Israel, but that significantly includes Israeli emigres, like yourselves, that is trying to grapple with what do we do and what this means, and sees the actual existing Zionist project as a threat to those who they care about over there, who are still on the land there, and to Jews everywhere, that is being so transparently reckless in how it instrumentalizes Jewish communal life on the outside, how it endangers Jews, how it aligns, whether in the US or in Europe, how it tries to align Jewish communal well-being with the reemergence of Western fascism. We see it. You're in Germany, I'm in the UK, and they're very different, but they're very similar in that core thing. So I do think we're increasingly going to see an attempt to offer something different, to say, and I don't know how integrated into this the Israeli emigre community are going to be, but Germany is interesting in this respect, in terms of saying, as Jews, as people who are thinking about the Middle East, and as people who are thinking about life in this new country that we've adopted, or in this country where we live, if we're talking about Jewish communities, what the Israel propaganda crew, the state itself, are saying is fundamentally wrong, and we're going to build something different. Will that then permeate and percolate back into Israel itself? At what point, if at all, let's throw in if at all, at what point will you begin to get a critical mass of Israelis who say, WTF? Something is fundamentally going wrong. And I'm, I think, realistic enough to acknowledge that may actually only happen if Israel is militarily deterred and contained. It may not happen as a moment of moral awakening to go there. But I think the military and the military deterrence and containment of Israel may be becoming visible on the horizon. This Iran war is quite significant. And the fact that a growing number of states in the region see Israel as a destabilizing, radicalizing threat. Now, it's a perfectly reasonable Israeli bet to say, yeah, nice thinking. We are so superior militarily, strategically, and those guys are so divided. Do you think that a few meetings between Saudi, Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan, which have been taking place, translates into something that actually tries, over time, has the capacity, they can agree with each other to contain us? Do me a favor. Just because China sells kit to Pakistan and Pakistan has a nuclear weapon, this is going nowhere. I'm not sure. I'm not so sure. And I would like to believe that it doesn't come down to a question of a new possibility only emerges as a consequence of military containment, that it could come from other places. Where that leaves me, by way of closing, I do think that not only as a consequence of my life journey, but also because it is a real, genuine question that deserves to be answered, that one has to consider the Israeli Jewish future on that land, and one has to encourage Palestinians and others not to follow Zionism's zero-sum path. That as crazy a notion as it sounds, coming up with something reminiscent of the Freedom Charter of the African National Congress from South Africa, that the alternative to running an apartheid system is something in which you also have a future. And actually, you'll have a future where you won't have to send every generation of your kids to war. That is a necessary part of the change. And then the other thing that's very personal to me is how do we wean Jewish life off of this Zionist Israel centricism? And I'm very under the influence of a wonderful book that I've just started reading, which I think just captures a zeitgeist. and it's a history of the Bund.
I just bought it.
It's wonderful. Molly Crabapple. Here where we live is our country. Because I think and it's interesting, you just bought it as well, and it's a bloody history of the Bund, right? Like, why is this becoming a phenomenon? Like, who in their right mind would think that a history of the Bund, like, it's in all the big festivals and people are really reading it and paying attention to it? Because we need something. Because we need to connect to something. And many of us are not going to become Orthodox practicing Jews in that sense. And at the end of the day, tying our identity to the Holocaust is a pretty negative thing. And we need something else to draw on that is not Zionism and Israel. And we are also, which is very Bundist, we are in a moment where this isn't just about us. We have a particularist role, but we are in a moment in global history where, whether it's saving the kinds of democracies we thought we lived in, or whether it's saving the planet we live on, all these kinds of questions are there at the forefront. And so I think it's just indicative of people are looking for something to draw on. So that's where I'm drawing some hope from at the moment. And then, at the same time, Omar Bartov brings out, which is, precisely the kind of argument that needs to take place. Like, what went wrong? Did it really go wrong? Was it wrong to begin with? I think sometimes we're too dismissive of, it's just a couple of intellectuals running a podcast from a loft. It looks like a loft in Berlin, or debating things on the pages of books that people aren't reading. I think that's too dismissive. I think there is the shifting of a zeitgeist, which, if we can apply some political strategy to it, can shift through into many other things.
Amen.
Amazing, Daniel. Thank you for everything, and especially, you probably it's long history or old history for you, but to speak with you about Oslo was something we were hoping to do here for a long time. And I hope that your voice would be heard a little bit more in our Israeli country, because I don't know, you speak good Hebrew, and maybe all our listeners who are working for the channel.
אבל הוכחנו את ההפך.
כן, לא, אבל...
זה באנגלית.
But they know you do, and our listener from Channel 12 will now contact you to have you on board, speaking with Ben Caspit, Amit Segel, and someone else in the, a bit about this kind
אתה
of
ממש
stuff.
שונא אותי.
No, thank you so much, really, it was a pleasure.
תודה רבה, דניאל.
תודה.